This is Main Street Manifest, May 28th, 1936. "An honest-to-goodness spy," cried Letty as the three of us crouched behind the wooden Indian in front of the hardware store. "Right here in Manifest? Why, I've never heard anything so exciting." I kept the mementos hidden away in the cigar box, but showed them the first letter and the spy map. It might have been a little selfish of me, but I wanted to read the other letters by myself before letting Letty and Ruth Ann see them. Maybe there would be some mention of Gideon in those. The Rattler. That sounds as mysterious as the Shadow.
Shadow was a radio program. Ooh, the Shadow knows.
Letty took on the deep, dramatic voice everyone knew from the Sunday night radio broadcast.
Who knows what evil lurks in the heart of men? The Shadow knows. Ooh.
Ruth Ann rolled her eyes. "In fact," Letty continued, "it's just like that episode a few months ago. A lady gets mysterious letters from her dead husband." "Well, they're not letters really. They're more like notes because they don't come in the mail. They're just left under her pillow. And right before she goes insane?"
Who would have known?
Now, not now, Letty," Ruth Ann said. "The Rattler, whoever it was, could still be here spying on us at this very minute. After all this time, the letter was written," Letty did the calculating in her head, 18 years ago. "And I don't see how this map is going to help us." She looked over the paper. "It's just a map of Manifest, or at least Manifest as it was back in 1918. See here, that Matanopolis meet closed down forever ago." The cousins' debate continued. Ruth Ann said, "So maybe it's a map of likely suspects and places the spy might frequent. Maybe he's dead by now. The Matanopolis place is on there, and Mr. Matanopolis is dead. Maybe you shouldn't be such a stick in the mud. Come on, let's scout around." As we all got up, I figured Ruth Ann had won, and from Letty skipping along beside us, I gathered she didn't mind. We looked up and down Main Street, taking in store owners and passers-by. There was the butcher, hanging up a big hunk of meat to cure outside his store. He pulled the fleshy meat hook and wiped it on his already bloody apron. The iceman whacked his spiky tongs into a block of ice and hoisted it out of his truck. The barber shook out his apron and wiped his razor blade clean. Thinking of spies and people going insane made everyone seem a little frightening. They were like nameless men in a scary nursery rhyme. The butcher, the iceman, and the barber. Until Letty identified them as Mr. Simon, Mr. Pickerton, and Mr. Cooper.
What about the butler in the study?
There is no butler in the study. We made our way into and out of a few stores, asking if anyone had heard of the Rattler. No one seemed inclined to shed any light on the matter. The Rattler could be any of them, Letty breathed. But I still say the Rattler could be dead and buried by now.
Yeah, his career's dead and buried in South Carolina.
Or maybe not, Ruth Ann said with authority. "Look, it was the undertaker, all dressed in black, hauling a slab of granite into the Better Days funeral parlor." "Maybe it's Mr. Underhill," Ruth Ann whispered. "He's always itching to carve somebody a grave marker. Maybe he even killed a few bodies himself." The letter didn't say anything about murder. "We're just looking for a spy, right, Abilene?" Letty asked. "Yes, but what?" Ruth Ann asked. "Well, say there was a spy. What do you think he was spying on?" Letty and I looked at Ruth Ann. She rolled her eyes and gave a sigh, like she was disgusted to have to explain something so simple. I figured she was just stalling till she could think up an answer. "There was a war going on, you know," Ruth Ann said. We kept staring, and in war times there's always secrets that need keeping from the enemy. Still staring. "So what makes you think Manifest didn't have a few secrets of its own that some spy might want to find out about?" Ruth Ann asked. Since Letty and I couldn't come up with a better explanation, we shrugged and turned our eyes back to Mr. Underhill, who'd come outside. He wiped the sweat off his forehead and looked up at the cloudless sky. "Look at him," Ruth Ann said. "He's sniffing for death in the air." A breeze picked up, and when Mr. Underhill crossed the street walking in our direction, I thought for sure he'd pluck one of us for that new grave marker. We backed into an alley and watched as he passed by. He hunched forward and his arms didn't move as he walked. They just hung stiff by his side. "Come on," Ruth Ann whispered, and we all three took off after Mr. Underhill. He headed to the edge of town and skirted around the trees near Shady's place. Letty stepped on a twig, snapping it in two, and Mr. Underhill turned around. We stayed still in the darkness of a tree until he moved on. "Where's he going?" I asked. "Where else would an undertaker go?" Ruth Ann pointed ahead to the wrought iron fence that surrounded hundreds or maybe 50 or so graves. So it's not a very big cemetery.
No.
"Come on, there's an opening on the other side." This was one of the universals I had so far avoided. In other places, I'd seen kids who followed their leader like blind mice, right into the carving hands of the farmer's wife. Do you know that nursery rhyme?
Yes, I do. 3 blind mice.
3 blind mice.
See how they run.
See how they run.
Read on.
Being an outsider, I didn't usually fall under the leader's spell, but I'd never been on a spy hunt before. So here I was, traipsing after Ruth Ann, enjoying the excited, scared feeling that made my spine shiver. Ruth Ann went first, squeezing through the fence where there was a missing iron rod. Then Letty, then me. "Over here," Ruth Ann said, crouching behind a tall tombstone. We followed, then waited and peeked. Mr. Underhill plodded over to a grassy spot between graves and stretched his arms between the markers. His fingertips barely brushed the stones on both sides. I'll be hung if he didn't lie flat on his back then, like he was ready to die himself. From our hiding spot, we could only see his knees poking up as his long legs butted against another grave marker in front. He lay there, seeming a little too comfortable. Then he got up and made some notes on a pad of paper, and arms hanging down again, walked out of the cemetery. What do you think he's doing?
He's measuring out a grave.
We waited for the gate to quit squeaking before we gave up our hiding spot. "He's measuring for somebody's grave," Letty said.
Who would have known?
Ruth Ann looked over the grassy space Mr. Underhill had recently occupied. The way his legs were bunched up looks like there's not enough room for a full-grown adult. She stretched out her arms, measuring length as the undertaker had done. Then, with one hand about the same height in the air, she turned real slow. "In fact, I'd say there's probably just enough room for someone about the size of one Soletta Taylor."
Boo!
She placed her hand on Letty's head. "You stop that right now, Ruth Ann McIntyre, or I'll tell your mother that you used her colander for catching tadpoles." Oh my gosh, I'd have to burn that colander. Ruth Ann laughed. "Oh, don't get your knickers in a knot." "Let's go home, Ruth Ann," Letty said. "I'm thirsty and Mama will be awful upset if she finds out I was clear out in the woods. It must be near midnight." "For heaven's sake, Letty, it's barely dark." "Still," Letty whined, just a little. "Oh, you're probably right. Supper will be waiting at my house too," said Ruth Ann. I hated to see them go. "Maybe we can find a creek to fill our pop bottles," I suggested. "There's nothing more than a trickle within 100 miles of here. Everyone knows that," said Ruth Ann, kicking up dust as she walked. "My daddy said he'd heard the drought hadn't taken hold here like it had in other parts." "Well, it's bad enough," she answered, stuffing a wad of grass in her lip like tobacco as we made our way back to Shady's place. "Still," said Letty, "Uncle Louver says folks around here are lucky. Least there's underground wells to draw from to keep people watered. He says places not that far west of here are so dry people shrivel up like November leaves and blow away all the way to California." Now, do you think they really do that? Shrivel up and blow away?
No, I believe they get in jalopies and they go west.
So what's that called when they exaggerate? Do you know?
I don't.
Hyperbole.
Hyperbole.
So mark that in your book as hyperbole. Hyperbole. It looks like hyperbole.
Or hyperbole.
Or hyperbole.
Hyperbole.
Hyperbole. We started back toward the treehouse to get Ruth Ann's pack. I'm tired, Letty groaned. Nice to meet you, Tired. I'm hungry, Ruth Ann answered, pulling a half-eaten apple from the sack.
Ba-dum-bump.
Truth was, we all seemed to be getting a little tired of the spy hunt and probably would have dropped the whole thing right then if it hadn't been for what happened next. When we got back to Shady's property, we saw that there was a note nailed to the trunk of Fort Ticonderoga at eye level, right on the knobby bark. Someone didn't want us to miss it. What's it say? Letty asked. I tore it off the nail and adjusted the paper to read it in the dimming light. There were only 4 words written on it, each one capitalized. I read it out loud.
Leave well enough alone.
It was more jarring than scary, but it was scary too.
Leave well enough alone.
To think that somebody not only knew we were on the trail of the Rattler, but had taken the time to write a note to 3 girls. What had we stirred up? What was the writer of the note afraid of?
Leave well enough alone.
That means the Rattler's still here, Ruth Ann said, alive and kicking. She took a bite of apple. How can you eat at a time like this? Letty said with a shiver. He knows we're looking for him. Ruth Ann continued munching, pondering the situation. Maybe we shouldn't have come right out and asked about the Rattler. It was a little late for that revelation, I thought. What are we going to do now? What are we going to do now? Letty repeated. Aren't we going to...
Leave well enough alone.
Ruth Ann looked at Letty like she'd given the wrong answer to 2 + 2. Of course we're not going to.
Leave well enough alone.
We're going to start up our spy hunt again, first thing tomorrow.
Atta girl.
I put the note into my pocket for safekeeping. We made plans for Letty and Ruth Ann to come back the next morning and said our goodbyes. The saloon church looked warm and inviting with its light glowing through the stained glass windows, but I wish Gideon was there waiting for me to say goodnight to me. I reached for the compass to hold, but it was gone. My heart pounded, and even though I hadn't moved, I felt like I'd lost my bearings. Why do you think she felt like she had lost her way or lost her bearings?
Because she didn't have the compass, which was her most precious possession. And the compass would show her what direction was north.
Correct.
And Iowa
but it was broken.
north. It was broken. She'd have to do the best she could.
The compass was my most valued possession, and I'd lost it twice in 2 days. I must have snagged it when I'd squeezed through the cemetery fence. The cemetery. Now, no human being wants to be in a cemetery at night. No normal one, anyway. But I had to find Gideon's compass. You think she's going to go back to the cemetery?
Yep, I think she is.
Ugh. Ruth Ann, Letty, I called, hoping they'd go back with me. They were already out of earshot. I couldn't ask Shady. Wasn't sure how he'd feel about us following Mr. Underhill into the cemetery in the first place. Didn't plan to show him the note either. That would surely end our spy hunt. So I did the only thing I could. I turned my feet back toward the cemetery and made them walk, one in front of the other. The moon was on the rise and shed some light for me to look around by, but also made strange shadows on the tombstones. I searched near the fence, but found no compass. I slipped back through it to look, wandering around the markers. I couldn't help noticing the dates, wondering if Gideon had known some of these folks while they were still among the living. Some stones had sweet little verses. Others said something about the person who was 6 feet under. Some of them spoke volumes about the deceased's life and times.
Here lies John Foster, exemplary humanitarian, distinguished businessman, civic leader, generous philanthropist, and devoted father of 10.
And next to John Foster,
Here lies Mary Foster, wife of John.
what does that say about women in this time period?
Well, depends on when they were buried, but they obviously were buried before 1936.
Correct. And the husband, they have all these great things to say about him. He's wonderful. And he has 10 kids. But for his wife, all they can come up with is her greatest accomplishment is wife of John.
Here lies John Foster. Boing, boing.
Here lies Mary. Wah,
Wife of
wah.
John.
Yeah. They didn't even put mother of 10, and she had 10 kids.
Maybe she was too tired to even order that up.
The wind was picking up, blowing a warm, dry air over me. I was about to give up my hunt until morning when I heard a faint sound, something akin to church bells beckoning in the distance. I squeezed back through the fence and let the breeze take me just a little further toward the sound. I knew I was nearing the gate marked Perdition, and sure enough, there was what Charlotte had called Miss Sadie's divining parlor, that den of iniquity. Preachers use the word iniquity when talking about the strange and wicked. That divining parlor looked to fit the bill, meaning fit the part. Wind chimes of all shapes and sizes lined the porch, making their lonely music in the breeze. And hanging among them was my compass, glinting in the moonlight. How it had got there, I couldn't be sure, but I knew the wind hadn't carried it. Someone had hung it there. The house was dark, and a rocking chair added an unharmonious sound to the delicate tinkling of the chimes. It creaked back and forth in the dark shadows of the porch. I opened the wrought iron gate with all its welded forks and pans and tender-footed my way to the porch. What's tender-footed?
Lightly treading, up on tiptoes.
Sneaking up.
Yeah, very quiet, very quiet.
The compass hung far from the stairs, and the porch was too high to reach from the ground. But beside the uneven steps was a large clay pot. Going up onto the porch seemed like it would be asking for trouble, so I scooted the pot over. It was so heavy I could barely move it. I hoped I'd scooted it within reach of my compass. My balance was good enough. I stepped up on the lip of the pot, holding on to the porch rail to steady myself, and reached for the compass. Just another inch. If the breeze would just catch the compass and nudge it my way. But the breeze had died down.
Of course.
But the rocking chair still moved. I stood motionless, realizing that it wasn't the wind rocking the chair, but a large, dark form sitting in it. I caught my breath with a tiny cry and tumbled to the ground, breaking the pot in two.
That's just not her night.
The figure heaved itself from its chair, and I confess I didn't stay long enough to see what happened next. I ran home, made an excuse to Shady about not being hungry, and was in bed before you could say boo. Even as my heart was still thumping loud, it didn't drown out the sound of those chimes in my head.